Right now in Brussels, they're debating what they call the Digital Fairness Act, and part of that are supposed to be prohibitions or at least sort of like limitations on addictive design. When I hear the amount of time that young people spend watching 20-second videos, like hours on end, right? Nobody can tell me that that's a good thing. They find it genuinely difficult to resist these things.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Daniel Mügge, who is professor of political arithmetic at the University of Amsterdam, and where his research investigates the European governance of artificial intelligence. That is the topic of our conversation today. Daniel, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Yeah. Hi, Adam.
So in your work and some of the thought leadership that you've been doing, some of the public policy writing that you've done, you talk about digital sovereignty, particularly in the case of Europe in this era of artificial intelligence. So what does digital sovereignty really mean in practice, generally, but also in particular for Europe? And to put a bit more nuance to that, why should citizens care if U.S. tech companies continue to dominate here, or perhaps in the future, Chinese tech companies?
Yeah, good question. See, I think digital sovereignty in the first instance means a lot of things to a lot of people. That's what has made it so attractive in the whole Brussels policy bubble, right? In the sense that you can put a whole different range of projects into that. If you want to try to build European open AI, you can say, well, we need digital sovereignty, so let's build, European counterparts through regulatory protectionism, for example, to large American companies. But you can also use it for political projects that are, say, further to the progressive end of the political spectrum, in the sense that you say we need citizens to claim back control over their digital life world. So when it comes to why has this term become so prominent in Brussels, I think it's ex ante pretty open to different interpretations. Now, for me personally, I think it's actually a combination of these two things. Digital sovereignty to me means that public authorities, with the power that's vested in them by citizens, can actually shape how digitization of our societies takes place. I'll come back in a second as to why that matters. But in order even to be able to say, well, this is the kind of digitization that we want in our societies, that requires that you can also shape, for example, what companies can or cannot do, which business models you find legitimate, because they may end up squeezing other firms that are in the market or squeezing customers or citizens or something. And so I think what Europeans have found out and people in Brussels have found out is that the fact that the tech stacks, so the different facets of the digital technologies that we use here, everything from submarine cables to computing centers to software and AI and devices, what have you, the fact that that's dominated by foreign companies has in effect turned out to limit the scope that there is to shape the kind of digitization that we want in a society. So that's, for me, the important thing about digital sovereignty. I personally also tend to think about digital self-determination. I want societies to be able to sit in the driving seat of how their societies digitize, because I think we see around us that there are good ways of digitizing societies, but there are also pretty nefarious side effects. And if you want to avoid those, you need public authorities to be even able to make a change there.
So let's unpack this a bit, because if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's not per se a negative concern with the dominance of U.S. tech companies, in the sense that it's not that Google or Facebook or Meta these days or Amazon are necessarily bad companies, or OpenAI are bad companies with nefarious intent. It's more that because they're so far away, the distance between these companies and the citizen is too far to influence how these companies operate in the European market. Is that the understanding? And is it's less of a response to a negative concern, and it's more of a, we want to flip it in the positive so that we can shape it?
To me personally, yes. So if let's consider this counterfactual. If there was a European version of Google, but that did everything the same way that Google does, would that be better or not? I think the only reason why that would be better would be because then there might be more scope for European public authorities, either at the national level or at the European level, to say, well, here are certain aspects of how you conduct your business that we think has negative externalities, has negative side effects on society, because it stifles competition, but maybe also because it messes with our education systems in ways that we don't like, or these sorts of things. And you would find that if Google was a European company, it might be easier to get them to rejig their business models, their operations, the products that they have out there than is the case than when they're far away. Now, let me make one thing clear just here. So I do have a lot of concerns about the way that digital companies affect our societies. Maybe in a moment we get to that. But the reason why it matters whether these companies are American or Chinese or European is primarily for me because that has an impact on the influence that we as publics can have over them. The fact that there is an American flag on the box of my laptop, or whether there is a Chinese flag or UK flag or a Slovak flag, that in and of itself concerns me less than what's actually inside the box and the effects that that has on society.
Okay. Because I guess the reason why I wanted to frame it that way is often it feels as though the calls in Europe for a European tech champion tend to feel a bit more chauvinistic in that we need a European champion in digital because we just need that to make us feel like we're still at the leading edge of technological change and development. And we want, obviously, the other benefits, tax revenue and jobs and so on and so forth. But what you're saying is that actually that's not your view, right? That it's not because it's some Silicon Valley or American company or a Chinese company. It's actually because, no, it's about how citizens engage, and it's less about these sort of economic nationalist concerns.
Yeah, I think that's right. So let's keep two things apart here. So there is an aspect that is about the weaponization of foreign tech ownership and the impact that that has on security, maybe something that we can get to in a second. But when it comes to the economic arguments, I think those are frequently overstated. You just mentioned two things. Adam, you mentioned the impact that these tech companies have on local employment, jobs, and also on tax revenues. And there, I think it's important to see that the number of people that a company like OpenAI employs is minuscule compared to Volkswagen or like a large Rotterdam harbor or something like that. So whether OpenAI is located in the Netherlands or in France or in the United States, in terms of the impact that that has on local employment, that really isn't a huge factor at all. And also when it comes to taxes, I mean, quite a few of these extremely large tech companies are famous or infamous for their ability to evade what we might otherwise think of as like ordinary tax obligations that they have through all sorts of like super complicated constructions that involve the Bahama Islands, the Virgin Islands, and what have you not. So the tax revenue also, I think, is less of an issue, among other things, because governments often don't seem to be prepared to tax as they should, if you ask me, but they're often not. And even when we think about where the money is earned, so as a Dutch-German citizen, nothing keeps me from owning Microsoft shares. If I want to be part of the Microsoft juggernaut or Amazon or whatever, or NVIDIA for that matter, if I want some of the profits that these companies are making and I want them to end up in a Dutch bank account here, there's nothing that keeps me from doing that. So the fact that NVIDIA is an American company doesn't mean that all the profits/dividends end up in the United States. No, they may end up on my bank account if I had any NVIDIA shares, which, disclaimer, I do not. But, so in many ways, I think these purely economic arguments as in which country, which society gets rich on the back of these companies versus which ones are actually impoverished because they don't have an American or a Chinese or a German flag on them, I think they're vastly exaggerated considering just how globalized the capital flows, the product flows, the tax flows, and all these things are.
No, I think I'm glad you said that, because that's the point that I tend to make as well, is you put it perfectly, right? I mean, you might not think you own NVIDIA shares, but I would imagine that you as a member of ABP, the Dutch Civil Servants and Academics Pension Fund, which I was a member of and still have investments in, I guarantee they probably own NVIDIA shares,
Yes.
maybe not directly, but through a mandate with an outside asset manager and across that. And that's Dutch pension funds, German retail investors, French retail and institutional investors. It's just how it works. I mean, I think where I'm sat here at Panmure House, one of our biggest supporters is Baillie Gifford, the asset manager, and they have made significant amounts of money for its clients by investing very early on in all of the big tech companies. They were early in on Tesla and Amazon and Meta and OpenAI. I mean, NVIDIA as well. I mean, these are very sophisticated investors, and they invest in American tech, and that money has come back to its clients. Sure. Some of their clients are in the US, their pension funds there, but they're also UK clients or European clients, right? So they're bringing that growth, if you like, back to local economies. I mean, here in Edinburgh, we're benefiting from it.
Yes.
And so I agree with you that economic argument about creating a European champion is it's not about the local jobs, and it's not about the let's say the profit that you would make from that, because we know that European investors are very heavily invested in European or in U.S. companies across sectors and will continue to be so. Now, then that sets it up to the issue of the capacity for European citizens to influence these tech giants. And that, in your argument, comes via the regulator, whether in Europe or at national level. Is it not, though, an issue that Europe, which prides itself being the regulator in chief, the Brussels effect that shapes industries across the world, is that not stifling innovation here in Europe, as some would say? And particularly innovation in AI in these tech sectors. So I guess, to put the question more succinctly, what is the level of regulation, if you like? What is too much? And what is enough to allow for citizen involvement, if like, or where we feel like we have a voice, we as citizens, in shaping this technological development?
No. See, the way I think about regulation and also innovation is not on some kind of a scale, that is sort of like high, low, or, a lot of innovation, thumbs up, no innovation, thumbs down. But for both of these things, I think, there are different axes that should dominate our thinking here. So when it comes to innovation, and then we'll come to the impact that regulation has on that. Innovation for me isn't necessarily a good thing. There's, for me, good innovation, there's useless innovation, and there's harmful innovation. And that's true for the impact that some technologies have on the world, because they cause a lot of environmental damage, but maybe also damage to the mental health of teenagers in the form of highly addictive, purposefully addictive apps on their smartphones. What I'm asking myself is, how can we get more of the kind of innovation that we feel makes our societies better off? And how can we also discourage or maybe push to the side, through whichever means, the kinds of innovation where we collectively feel those are innovations, those are new inventions that actually don't make the world a better place? Now, I mentioned already, and I think, they're important. You already mentioned companies like Meta, like Google. At the heart of what these companies do, so a company like Meta is an advertising company. That's where the absolutely large chunk of its revenue and profits come from. The social media platforms are, from the perspective of Meta's managers, advertising platforms, which means that there are dozens of billions of dollars spent to try to get people to buy stuff that otherwise they wouldn't buy because they didn't think they needed. That's still extremely profitable. To my mind, considering that many people actually feel that they, are experiencing a squeeze in their personal finances, the fact that's apparently profitable to spend all this money to get people to buy stuff that they don't want or need, that is not something that makes society a better place, to my mind. Like, that's something that's a negative. What that means is, if there is a regulation or some other policy in place somewhere that means that there is no European Meta in this particular case, that doesn't somehow mean for me, we're missing out on some important piece of innovation. If we have something to the contrary where it's about, improving diagnostics in hospitals or something, we're missing out on that, then I'd be with you. Then I'm saying, yes, that concerns me. We should be on that train. But from the fact that there is a company out there somewhere that comes with a new product and it's able to generate money with that, that in and of itself for me isn't a sign that something good is happening. It could be something very bad. Let me give you another example. If you have platform companies, so that could be Amazon with its platform, like its Amazon Marketplace, but also other platform companies. And what they end up doing is that they dominate a certain sector, whether that's food delivery, ride hailing, different kinds of retail, what have you not. Booking.com also falls into that category. And an important way in which they can make their money is that they use their panoptic power, that they can see all the transactions, they can see all the prices, they can use that basically to squeeze all the smaller players that are on their platforms and basically skim off part of the money that these other people and these other companies actually generate. Then that feeds into a higher inequality where these platform companies get extremely rich at the expense of others. And that, again, for me, isn't good news necessarily. So what I want to see is I want us to be able to make a difference between what to us is good innovation, gets our society forward, and harmful innovation, and maybe then in the middle. And let me say this last thing about this. I think that considering polarization in society, considering the number of people who are experiencing a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, who feel that somehow, we see that in political upheavals in many countries, demonstrations, violence, what have you not, rather extreme policies. I think making policies that actually work for the people, that even at that relatively soft level, you give people a positive feeling because their inner cities are still working and haven't been all waltzed over by online retailing and these sorts of things, that becomes a live issue for me. It's easy to say, what would digital policies be that, make citizens better off? I think that's no longer a luxury question, but making citizens feel better off and just give them a positive feeling about where they are with their society and in life. That's a real thing. Now, you asked about regulation. How does regulation factor into that? And isn't that an impediment to innovation? Now, as I said, first of all, I think it's fine and appropriate to push back against innovations that don't help our societies. The other thing is that regulation can also be actually an engine of innovation. So if you say, what would a social media platform look like that would still give us all the things that we want, the ability to communicate with each other, to access different kinds of content, but at the same time not have these harmful features, for example, that they're, swamped in content that distracts us, swamped in content that is designed and presented in a way, that generates addiction-like features, then, coming up with something like that and build a successful business on that requires a lot of hard thinking. So in many ways, I think squaring the circle of having digital innovation in a way that works for society can actually be a booster for innovation rather than something that holds it back.
So, okay, there was a lot you said there, and which I agree with. And I want to play a bit of devil's advocate in that the question of who should be regulating, in the sense of, if we think about regulation broadly, we things are regulated in different means, right? You have official public policy, rules, laws, etc., that a state or some authority sets. But we also regulate a lot of social relations by other means, right? So the family, being a parent, right? And I'm thinking about, what is the appropriate level of regulating a tech company? And I'm not saying it's an either or, but you can imagine, so I'm a parent, you're a parent. The challenge we see raising children in this day and age is, when do they get their first smartphone? I was shocked, and this is a few years now, my oldest daughter complaining to us, why am I the only one in my class that doesn't have a smartphone? I'm being left out. And you as a parent, my wife and I were really frustrated because we thought, what is wrong with all these other parents? Right?
Yeah.
Why are they giving these children phones? And then finally, we gave her a phone, and we did also in part because we don't want her to be miss out. And we also want, to have her learn and be able to communicate with her and give her the independence to where it's, she can arrange her own things and we can get in touch with her. But then, the subsequent questions come in. It's like, well, I want Snapchat on my phone, and because all the other kids have it. And then you look on it and you think, well, actually, the regulation of Snapchat says you must be 13 years old and you're not 13 yet, so you don't get it. And she's like, but all the other kids do it. And he's like, well, how is that happening? It's because their parents have just given in.
Yes.
And that's where I And again, going back to playing devil's advocate, it's that we could wait for the state to do it. We could wait for Brussels to do it, or we can, here in the UK, we can wait for Parliament, or we see across the US, right? I mean, I think the state of Utah is becoming more and more strict around social media use for young people, right? So it's not as if it's Europeans are the only ones concerned with regulation of tech companies. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has written extensively around what social media has done to young people. But it's that sense of what can we do as society or as communities, as parents, as families, to regulate this kind of behavior. And this is what I find, even as a parent, it's really difficult because you try to put time limits on the use of the smartphone. But then you find out they need laptops for school, and you can just download WhatsApp on your laptop. And so it's WhatsApp all the time. And you think, or they can watch YouTube and all these other kinds of things. And yeah, you can put restrictions on, but it's really, really hard to manage it and regulate it. And you think then, so this is where, again, it's trying to find that degree where there's more, I think, responsibility or even individual responsibility, but also finding that balance where the state is involved. And the reason why I talk about individual or parental or familial responsibility is in part because I think it's like with anything, we shouldn't have to wait for some higher authority to regulate our lives. In a way, I think it's important that we have agency over our lives. So I guess how then can we, in part because I think tech companies will respond to consumer pressure, right? They'll respond to the use of this, right? They'll respond to that concern, I hope, rather than waiting for the big, stick or hammer of the regulator. How do you see that playing out, or how can we kind of find that balance?
Yeah. So the first thing is, I don't think it's either or.
Yeah.
I think it has to be both. I mean, and so as you say, yes, I'm a parent, so I have a 15-year-old daughter and a 19-year-old, 16, she turned 16 a few days ago, and a 19-year-old son. For me personally, I think, it's been, so I've never had WhatsApp. I've never had Instagram. I've never had Facebook. So for me, from the very beginning, it was a very conscious choice to say, this sounds super old school, but I want to be able to read books. And I know
what's a book?
That
Excuse me, sorry.
It's
these things
you grind up a tree and you kind of like.
Oh. Yeah. Don't know what those are anymore.
Oh yeah, too few left of those.
Yes,
too.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So I made a conscious choice at some point to say, I need to, more than 10 years ago, I stopped watching television and, TV series, not because they were so bad, but because they were so good. Right. So this was the time of Breaking Bad and all this sort of stuff, which was amazingly good. But I noticed I had completely stopped reading, and for me, that was very important. And so I made a choice that if I want to be able to read a book at night, then the only way I can do that is if I simply stop watching. Now, I'm saying that as an example of where for me, something if you will, sort of analog, a spirit of analog resistance kicked in and that's the thing where I think, you're right. Yes, of course, there's a responsibility for families, for example. But the products that we're talking about here, they're extremely powerful. And they're meant to be powerful. And there is a lot of research into how these things can glue kids to their smartphones, right? This is not by accident. You could have different algorithms. You could have, that you just see your regular timeline, which is full with stuff that's whatever sort of thing. But instead, it's optimized for just gluing you to that screen. And so right now in Brussels, they're debating what they call the Digital Fairness Act. And part of that are supposed to be prohibitions or at least sort of limitations on addictive design to switch off, features like autoplay. When I hear the amount of time that young people spend watching 20-second videos, hours on end, right? Nobody can tell me that that's a good thing. And many of the teenagers, that's something when I talked to my daughter recently about this, who doesn't have TikTok herself, she also at some point just deleted it because it's just too much. She says that just about any of her friends that she talks to, they say it's bad for me. Yeah. They say I don't like this. It's not it's not that they don't know. It's not that they think that that's a great way to spend their afternoon. Yeah. But they find it genuinely difficult to resist these things. So just as we've done with cigarettes and other kinds of things where we say, people need and appreciate a little bit of help. We cannot make our whole society more healthy if we somehow help people keep these things at bay a little bit, right? So that's one thing there. The other thing that I think is important, you said earlier, well, companies might listen to some of these things. I think that depends. So first of all, the business model of many of these companies, or I guess just about all of the companies in the tech sector, is that you if at all possible, occupy de facto a subsector of your market. It's really hard to think of important subsectors that aren't either an oligopoly, 2-3 companies, maybe 3 dominating the show, or maybe a de facto monopoly in there. ASML in the Netherlands making machines to make computer chips, for example, something like that. If you're in that position, then you can get away with a lot of stuff. So I've recently tried, again for my daughter, to switch off a feature on her iPhone. I don't have an iPhone myself, but to switch off a feature on her iPhone. She's spent a lot of time with Apple customer service. We've tried all sorts of things. She went to the Apple store to get this thing switched off, which doesn't make any sense, like detailed feature in her settings. Impossible. Like there's no way you can get out of their clutches. Transferring your data out of there is impossible. So it's by design that once you've entered the universe of either Apple devices or some other operating system or a tech stack of a particular company. So, and again, like there, for example, there would and should be real scope for public authorities to say, we want citizens to have choice. If they want to get out, they should be able to get out. And just because they started using Instagram when they were 14 and they care about the vacation pictures that are sort of like in their timeline, that shouldn't have to mean that for the remaining decades of their lives, they can't get out of this company anymore, right? So there has been an important push for interoperability of different kinds of messenger apps and these sorts of things. But unsurprisingly, because it's so integral to their business model, these companies fight tooth and nail and come up with all sorts of excuses why, no, it's not possible. We can't do this. If you use WhatsApp and I use Signal, no, we can't send each other messages. Even though with email, that's no problem at all. And yes, there's this snag and that snag and something. So I think there is a real role for public authorities to at least give people the choice. And then it's up to them. Then it's up to families. If there is a genuine choice out there, but as long as there isn't, I think we need a higher power to sort of help us along here a little bit.
No, I agree with you on that. I think it's going back to your analog point. I, when at all possible, try to read physical newspapers.
Yeah.
I mean, I read a lot on my phone. I've got subscriptions to a few things, and but also physical newspapers, because I find that it's a different reading experience.
Yeah.
It's when you open a newspaper and you flip through page to page, I don't want to say forced to, but you're confronted with different stories in a way that you engage with them differently, and I think you engage with them more broadly. Whereas the experience of reading, whatever news site on your phone is that you're more selective.
Definitely.
You pick things, and I think the same goes for reading of books. I don't like reading books digitally. If I can help it, reading, articles, PDFs, not really helpful. Physically reading something that is tangible, I think actually changes the experience. And I think that also goes then to the broader issue of how that technology shapes our brains and how we interact with information, and also how we use information, right? So I think if we turn it to artificial intelligence, I'm very concerned about how we're going to learn how to write. And in writing, we learn how to shape arguments and build arguments, but we have this technology that's changing that. And you mentioned, short videos on TikTok or YouTube, and when I watch my youngest watch YouTube shorts, and I just tell her constantly, "Oh, you're watching more stupid videos," and I'm very kind of blunt with her in a joking way, and she's like, "No, they're not stupid." It's like, yeah, how many stupid cat videos can you watch, or people just doing the dumbest things? And it's just like this addictive kind of, it's like, okay, snort another line of Coke or something like that. That's literally what it's like. That's not, again, it's not to say I'm against sort of short videos. I mean, we'll have some shorts from this conversation because it's useful sometimes when you have information, but it's just the kind of mind-numbing ones where you see these influencers, and even the longer kind of episodes they do, it's all this like in your face, hyper and, I can't explain. I mean, everyone listening knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it's just, you do feel helpless as an individual or a parent at sometimes, because it's not so simple to be like, no, you're going to be cut off, and, we're going to not let you engage with what all your other friends are doing or being part of that. And also, again, to play devil's advocate, there's a lot of benefits that we get through the information age. I mean, our capacity to find information, I think, it's not something we should discount. I mean, I just remember as a kid growing up, and I'd hear something, I'd be like, oh, that's really interesting. Like if I was in a movie and it was like some historical thing, I was like, oh, that's fascinating. And you think, oh, how can I get information about that? It wasn't so simple. You'd have to go to the library, and nowadays, I just go down a rabbit hole of Wikipedia and just keep going and going and going, and you learn all the kinds of random stuff. And I think that there's benefits to technology in that respect. But I just want to turn, though, to the issue of how to regulate and how to, who's going to do it, right? Because and on the question of Europe, because again, I think you get the sense that, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm happy to be told I'm wrong, is that there is the perception that Europe is quick to regulate because they don't have an industry of themselves.
Uh-huh.
And you see this playing out in the U.S. I mean, it's kind of political science 101. It's like, why are all the tech CEOs at Trump's inauguration? And, because they're trying to protect their industry, right? And they're trying to shape, I mean, they've got reams of lobbyists and the like, this is the game they play. And because the tech industry is dominant there and it's a, big moneymaker, politicians listen. That's kind of how it works. And in the European case, like, well, we don't have an industry to protect.
Yes.
Oh, well, just regulate it, right? And that's the accusation that you hear. And so but then I think that does pose a risk for Europe, right? Is that is it not then going to limit the capacity for Europe to engage with these companies? Because these companies will just, I know I'm not articulating my question well enough, but perhaps I put it this way. But I mean, we've sort of talked about this, but then is it going to stifle European startups and European companies in this particular space? And I guess how can we find that relationship where, European tech startups that are doing the good things that you want to do can do it without being told how to do it?
Yeah. So on the first one, I think that's absolutely right. Yes, it's so much easier to regulate a sector if you don't have your own domestic lobbyists, constituencies breathing down your neck, right? So we've had different kinds of things around, say, the German car industry and how they got off the hook for all sorts of things and how they get special government treatment because it's like a huge factor in the German economy and employment. People know each other. Different states, Bundesländer, are actually invested in, the sector in different kinds of ways. So you see a clear difference there. Yes, it is much easier for Brussels to just say, oh, we don't like this, so let's regulate away. Totally agree. That is the dynamic. Is it a bad thing? Ex ante, not necessarily. So like if the alternative scenario is that there is a natural inhibition to regulate a sector simply because some are beholden to it economically in different kinds of ways, then if you feel free as a public authority to say, okay, there is no backroom dealing here or anything, I can just say, you should stop doing this, so please stop doing this, then I think that's a good thing. When it comes to the stifling aspect, I think there are two things. One thing we talked about already, and that is that for me personally, innovation could be good or bad, and regulation in that sense could also be good or bad. And sometimes regulation simply means that you got to find a smarter way of developing that product that also conforms to the public demands. The other thing is that, yes, of course, like in certain kinds of instances, the key point of the regulation is to keep companies from doing stuff that's good for their bottom line, but bad for the citizens. And companies don't like that. They say, oh, we see the American companies, they're doing this and they're earning lots of money and that's great for them. And you're telling us we're not allowed to do this? You're like, yeah, that's exactly what we're saying, right? So in that sense, I think, that is partially the point as well, that part of these rules are about saying there are certain things that you're not allowed to do. But then there's another dimension, and that is something that has me worried. So there, I think I do agree with you, or maybe what you were hinting at. If we think about these digital technologies and AI first and foremost, from the perspective of policymakers, they're really moving targets. These things develop in real time, or actually like faster than in real time, because it seems to be going super quickly. If you think back when the European Union was drafting its AI rules, the AI Act, which was finally adopted in 2024. So they started doing that 3 years prior to that in 2021. The European Commission tabled its first proposal, and then everybody got negotiating. In that first proposal, there was nothing about generative AI. There was nothing about the likes of ChatGPT. Why? Because most people had never heard of the thing, right? So when it burst onto the scene in November 2022, these people were negotiating these rules, right? And it was all about, say, surveillance tech in public space and this sort of stuff, privacy concerns, discrimination, those sorts of things. People were like, whoa, this ChatGPT thing, that's big, right? And so while that regulatory train was already moving, they had to sit down and somehow like add this whole section to these mega complex law to say, by the way, and then there are these other generative AI models, we somehow need to do something about them. That's one example of how public authorities are sort of like constantly behind the actual technological developments, right? So I think the intention to say we need some kind of meaningful guardrails is good, but then when it comes to the ability of actually put them in place in a way where different stakeholders, including the companies themselves, have been able to say, well, this is workable, this is not workable, what have you not, and then think about how you're going to enforce all that stuff, you'll always be lagging behind. And that means that public policy, it feels, can systematically not achieve what it would like to achieve. And that's a kind of handicap that I find really frustrating, and I think that generates a lot of frustration also on behalf of companies. So the ones that have great ideas that are good for society just as much as those that have more nefarious business models. But all of them, of course, constantly feel, and I can understand that point, that they're dealing with a set of rules that is somewhat mismatched, that is somewhat undercooked with respect to the business that they're trying to run. And that's I think, it's a really, really tough problem to solve.
Because what it then does is, for a lot of, tech startups and founders, is, there's the financing issue, but there's also that sense, well, if I go to America, go to Silicon Valley, I can just kind of get things done. Whereas here, I have to worry about the regulator behind me looking and saying, "Oh, you can't do that." And it's like, well, I don't know what I'm doing yet, right? Even the founders don't know what they're doing, and they're being kind of stifled in that respect. I think that's the bigger risk. So, would you say then that that for the Europeans, the risk that they have is that they're trying to think of all the scenarios about this new technological world, and they're trying to regulate it before it even exists. And that might stifle innovation, or at least kind of constrain business in that world, such that it gives more space to the Americans or the Chinese to develop these technologies at the expense of building something locally here in Europe or the UK. And a better response would be to actually focus on what's been created and then regulate it that way. Right? Or
I think there are two axes that we need to keep apart. So there is the axis, what do we want the regulation to achieve? And the Europeans say, out of the following 10 things that you could do with AI, those 5 we think are okay. Go ahead, innovate away. And there's these other 5 that we think we don't want because, for different kinds of reasons. And yes, the companies that want to build these 5 things here in Europe, they'll have to go elsewhere. Right. They can set up their business in the US. And in this case, the European authorities say, okay, fine, but like we just don't do this stuff here. And whether we think that's for the better or not is a different question, but in principle, I think that's legitimate. That's a different issue than what you could think of as undercooked or incomplete regulation, where the issue is not that there is a clear understanding of what it is that what we want and what we don't want, and there's just like the blurriness of the rules, the inability to enforce them properly, the fact that they haven't been thought through, that pushes people away. That then is a different issue. Now, how you find the right balance there, where you say, because the alternative scenario that you just mentioned, Adam, is that you would say, okay, let everybody just do their thing. And if we actually see things going wrong somewhere, then we can still intervene. That gives me the goosebumps a little bit, because I feel that these technologies, among other things, because they are so fast moving and so powerful, we talked earlier about the effect of social media on, say, for example, mental well-being of teenagers. Something, and you mentioned several examples, people that have written extensively about these things, also with a lot of publicity. But that's something where I feel that for a very long time, people have had concerns, and parents, but also just, adults themselves, young people have been looking at these technologies. They were like, wow, this doesn't look good. Like there's something going on here that really doesn't feel right in so many kinds of ways. But we didn't maybe have yet like rock solid scientific evidence that, this was really harmful. And so people were like, oh no, back off. This is only anecdotal or something. Even though everybody could sort of feel that it was like in so many ways not doing our societies really a whole lot of good, or at least that there were serious downsides. So once you say you can only as a public authority, step in, once there is rock solid proof that something is harmful, I fear that frequently we're going to be too late. So personally, I'm willing to say, I mean, and we'll get maybe in a minute to how that plays out in this context where we have the United States and China as digital superpowers, and whether then this strategy is still right for Europe. But I'm comfortable with a situation in which we take things slow, thinking of ourselves for a moment, take a precautionary approach, because I feel that when I look around our societies, like most of the problems that I can see on the street in our politics, also like looking towards the future, think of things like sustainability, what have you not, just about all of these problems are not ones that can or will be solved by digital technologies. Like we have real challenges in front of us as societies, but it's not that digital technologies will all of a sudden give us the answer and will move us out of these things. So like we have our construction sites right in front of us, and let's tackle those. And I think those are really urgent things to tackle as well. So if that means that we miss out a little bit on something that could be beneficial, but could also be super harmful in terms of technological innovation, that's fine with me. Now, of course, like the big caveat here is how to look in a situation where both the United States and China are, of course, barging ahead.
Right. So effectively, you're saying that we should follow the precautionary principle.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Which some people think Europe takes too seriously across different industries. And I guess it's how you interpret the precautionary principle. And for listeners, that's effectively the precautionary principle says that, well, if you're not certain 100% that this is going to be good, or if there's going to be bad things and you're not quite sure what those bad things are, you're better off having more precaution than just waiting and seeing. And I would agree in many cases we should have a precautionary. We should be careful, right, in our decision making. But if I'm just thinking about our conversation here, you're saying precautionary principle, but you're not saying at all costs, right? It's not one of, or correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps you are saying we should be very cautious. I guess if we think of the precautionary principle on a spectrum from very, very risk averse to a bit more less risk aversion, how would you sit there? And I guess the question is where is Europe now on that scale? And are they at risk of being too precautionary in that it stifles innovation, it pushes companies abroad? Or are they actually, on the more sort of permissive side? It's about being cautious, but reasonably so.
Yes, I think it depends very much on the use case, right? So if you say introduce digital technologies in financial systems, payment systems, or things like that, you find that also within Europe, for example, the degree of digitization of payment systems varies a lot from one country to the next. In Germany, it's still much more cash-based. Here in the Netherlands, or say in some Scandinavian countries, it's like all electronic. Right? So but that's a completely different story. Also, like the pros and cons that are involved and how easy it may be to find technical fixes for, say, privacy concerns or potential discrimination in whose payments go through and whose are blocked all the time. That's a different story than thinking about, okay, so what about, having an elementary school that's completely run on iPads? Is that a good idea? Should we do that? Should we mandate that? Should there be like a huge government program that says, invest tens or hundreds of millions of euros into equipping all the elementary schools with iPads because that's the future? That's a different thing. And if you think about hospitals and then you think about, whether it's, high schools should have the right to say, well, we ban smartphones, and start thinking through these things. And I don't think that there's a one size fits all answer to all of these. If we think back to the specific laws that were mentioned before, so the Europeans AI regulation, the AI Act, but also other rules like the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which are about, regulating basically, oligopolistic or potentially monopolistic company power in the Digital Markets Act's case, and then what happens to digital content and who's responsible for content that shouldn't be admissible, these sorts of things in the case of the Digital Services Act, then I think, again, what you find is that both of these laws are probably imperfect in different kinds of ways, but I do appreciate the idea of, in the first instance, saying, well, these are matters of public concern, And it should, in principle, be fair to say we want to step into that space and be active there as a public authority. So what that means for me is there over-regulation or under-regulation, I think, as I said, is not something that can be decided irrespective of the specific issue that we're talking about. And in the second instance, I think many of these tools we find out are then fine-tuned at a later stage. So what you basically do is you say, well, ex ante, public authorities have a particular power. It's legitimate for them to intervene. And where then exactly the threshold ends up being, where you say, okay, if you as a content provider, if you keep publishing certain kinds of content because you don't have proper content moderation, or you've been warned a number of times that there is a certain kind of hate speech that's inadmissible, but you don't seem to do anything about it as a platform, then sanctions will follow. Right? It's not as if there is a rule out there, and if X has one tweet that violates the rules of the Digital Services Act, then immediately the whole platform is shut down. Quite to the contrary.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think also there is sometimes a little bit of panic that somehow things are massively being suppressed. If I look around myself here at the University of Amsterdam, here in Amsterdam as a city, like there's digital technologies everywhere. There are cameras in public space that are used for surveilling public space, right? It's not as if these things don't exist here. It's, we don't live under a stone for what it's worth. Though in that sense, I think that panic about we're stifling the digitization of societies with all these rules, I think is a little bit overblown, at least from an Amsterdam perspective.
No, I would agree with you. And I would, I've got the portrait of Adam Smith behind me, and, some would argue that he's a theorist of power, and he was always concerned about the concentration of power.
Oh, most certainly.
And again, it's, whether that's state power or corporate power. I mean, The Wealth of Nations is a 1,000-page kind of takedown of the East India Company. It's a bit more involved in that, but he was very concerned about concentration of power in merchants or the state generally. And so I think...
You know what, Adam, actually, like the title of my PhD dissertation was a quote from Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. It was widen the market, narrow the competition, because he said, that was always the interest of the dealers.
Yes,
right? Adam
absolutely.
Smith.
Yeah.
And I think that is exactly, we talked earlier about the Digital Markets Act. Yeah. And of course, understandably so, because it's good money for them. But, like if I'm Google, yes, widening the market and narrowing the competition, like that's the headline above my corporate strategy, right? And understandably so. Like if I was the Google CEO, I would be doing exactly the same thing. But Adam Smith, right there behind you, identified that is not only a problem if we want the best products for the citizens at the best price, but also potentially might end up corrupting politics. And again, also that is something that we seem to be seeing. So, all the power to him.
Yes, that's why that's what we're doing here at Penmere House, is bringing the ideas of Adam Smith to life, because they're still very relevant. I mean, he was writing in a very different time period, very different technological. I mean, it was pre-industrial revolution, but he was still pretty prescient in terms of identifying how power corrupts, if you like, and how it constrains innovation and it constrains prosperity. And again, it's, I think, finding, though, again, to play devil's advocate, is the issue, though, of scale and economies of scale. And I'll give you an example. We had an event here last week, a Scottish-German event with the German consulate had organized, and we had the Minister for Health from Rhineland-Pfalz in Germany, and it was about AI in healthcare, and we had a panel discussion, which I was part of, and we had a professor from Koblenz University and a couple from the University of Edinburgh that work in that digital health space. And there was some discussion also with the audience about what do we do with this amazing health data? So in the UK, there's amazing health data sets, in part because of the NHS, but also Germany has very good health data sets. And there's that sense of, if we could just do something with it. And one of the discussions is that, well, we don't have, yes, there's the startups in Europe. There was some that were mentioned for the professor from Koblenz. So there's startups that, they're doing this great stuff. He was a computer science professor that could do these things. Someone in the audience, he had said that the problem we have here in the UK and Europe is we don't have the compute power. We don't have the scale that the Googles and the Metas and the Amazons have in this space. And what we're missing by kind of, I don't want to say hoarding the data, but being very careful with it, is that we're missing this opportunity for these big these big companies just kind of suck in this data and then use it to the benefit of public health and the provision of healthcare in the community, in hospitals, and so on and so forth. And, we did say that. So then one of the conversations was about, well, how could the NHS benefit from that by giving this data? But even then, so there's workarounds where you can kind of give the data and it's anonymized. But then, as one of the German guests that was there was saying, yeah, but the problem is we find that even in the German case, you have people that say, well, I don't want my GP to know that I've been seeing this other doctor over here, like really kind of basic stuff. So on the one hand, you think there's solutions to get the data to the big players and protect it in ways that matter for individuals. But at the same time, individuals want to retain that sovereignty and that power, which constrains that kind of collective benefit from that. And so I guess, my question is, how do we find those ways where we swallow the bitter pill, if you like, of engaging with these big tech companies that create mental health problems, but then mobilizing their compute power and their scale to really mobilize data and manipulate that data such that we have better provision of healthcare, we have better health innovation opportunities that benefit our aging societies here in Europe and the UK, and more broadly by mobilizing artificial intelligence to its fullest effect.
Yeah. So I think for me there's two things here. The first one is, I don't want to demonize American tech companies, right? It's not about the company itself per se. Many of these companies make amazing products. But for me, it is about the specific product that they have and the specific use to which it is put, and that we should have some kind of collective self-determination about where do we want what. What that means for me is, like, I don't have a problem per se if the proper safeguards are in place for using an Azure, so Microsoft, a cloud computing center to process certain kind of data, or whether that happens on a server farm that's owned by a European company or something. Like, for me, like that doesn't make very much of a difference per se. Like, there I would say, by all means, let's work together. And, I feel that we did that in the past as well, when there was less friction and, people still seemed a little bit more sanguine about like the future of the digital world and how it would tie us together across the globe and all these sorts of things. I think there are two issues, however, that complicate this picture a little bit. And the first one is the infrastructural power that the providers of these, in this specific case, for example, computing resources have. As you say, as we move into an era where more and more aspects of our lives are digitized, and where the amount of data that's being collected and that's being generated seems to grow exponentially, we rely more and more on these kinds of infrastructures. And as I said, in principle, whether they're owned by Microsoft or by Google or by a Dutch company like Nextcloud or something, ex ante used to be a little bit of a secondary concern. But I think that has changed the moment that we get the feeling that the leaders of foreign countries where these companies are headquartered are willing to weaponize their own leverage over these companies. To put this in concrete terms, it feels potentially threatening that somebody like Donald Trump can instrumentalize the sway that he has over Meta, the sway that he has over Microsoft, simply by the virtue of the fact that he's the president of the United States, and uses his power beyond what seemed to be the constitutional limits, to be frank. That becomes a concern to me, that I say, it's not Microsoft considered in and of itself, but it's Microsoft with Donald Trump behind it.
Right.
And if he, for example, were to feel that, that is a lever that would be useful for him to push to, say, apply extra pressure to achieve, what was called the trade deal with the European Union, for example, that you can start threatening countries to say, well, like if you start messing with my digital companies, then XYZ is going to happen. And there's a war in Ukraine going on. Like as we speak, there are, this has many twists, this particular story, but, yet again, there seem to be developments where the question is, would the United States, would it not somehow get involved if there was sort of like a broader confrontation between NATO and Russia and all these sorts of things, right? So in that context, like I do feel a little bit of unease when we're so dependent on companies that could be instrumentalized as tools of foreign policy there. So that for me is an argument in favor of saying, okay, what are aspects, what are specifically critical infrastructural aspects of these digital technologies where it is very wise for a country like the Netherlands or for the European Union as a whole to say we have more control over them. So if your payment systems depend significantly on Visa and MasterCard, and if there were a lever to say, well, we can start messing with your payment system here, and that's heavily digitized, then that's a problem, right? And for a long time, it didn't feel like one. But if you just turn this around for a moment and think about how willing would somebody like Donald Trump be to have U.S. payment systems dominated by a country, the leader of which would use the same kind of aggressive posture as Donald Trump has in the past done vis-a-vis the European Union? He and U.S. lawmakers would get very uneasy with that situation, right? And so in that sense, I don't think that there is anything weird about now at some point, people in Brussels being like, whoa, this is intense. And it gives me sleepless nights at some point. So there is a completely different argument why it might make sense to start thinking about, we started this conversation by talking about digital sovereignty. That's the whole question of how does it tie into security, and not then sovereignty as in, can I compete in the global marketplace with OpenAI? But am I in a more sort of like defensive way, at least master of my own affairs here at home? Or is there a serious risk that somebody can use extortion, blackmail, however you want to think about it, then extract other concessions in other policy fields by virtue of us relying on foreign digital technologies?
I agree with you 100%. I think that we need to tone it down across the world. And looking back at Adam Smith here, be concerned about not only the concentration of power, but the misuse of power. And you had mentioned that I was going to ask you what keeps you up at night as the final question, but you answered it for me. But it is, you mentioned that, there used to be a time when we looked at technological change as, oh, this is great, and look at what we can do. And I think for me, in my perspective here is, we need to return to that. We need to return to a world where there's not this intense geoeconomic competition, where it's not this intense worry that someone is going to weaponize our interdependence, right? Our engagement, right? Again, looking at Adam Smith, we all benefit from being from trading with each other and interacting with each other and sharing ideas with each other. And I think if we move to that, the world would be in a better place. We'll end it on that note. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us on the New Enlightenment. I thought our conversation was fantastic, and I'll hope to have you on again in the future. And definitely I'll have you here at some point in person at Panmure House. So thank you very much.
Right, looking forward to that already, Adam. Thanks to you too as well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.